Hello and welcome. Throughout history, certain figures have captivated the human imagination, embodying the highest ideals of courage, honor, and justice. Among these, the paladin stands out as a symbol of the eternal struggle between good and evil, a beacon of hope in times of darkness, and a warrior dedicated to a cause greater than themselves. From the battlefields of medieval Europe to the revolutionary movements of the Enlightenment, the paladin has been a figure of both myth and reality, a hero whose influence transcends time and culture. This documentary, The Paladin, A Journey Through History, delves deep into the origins, evolution, and lasting impact of the paladin ideal. Over the course of 5 comprehensive chapters, we will explore how the paladin has been portrayed in different eras, how this figure has adapted to changing societal values, and how the essence of the paladin continues to resonate in the modern world. Our journey begins in the heart of medieval Europe, where the paladin emerged as a paragon of chivalric virtue, inspired by the tales of the 12 peers of Charlemagne. These legendary knights, sworn to defend Christendom and uphold the chivalric code, became the archetype of the paladin, warriors whose lives were dedicated to the protection of the weak, the pursuit of justice, and the defense of their faith. In this chapter, we will explore the historical and mythological roots of the paladin, examining how these early figures were shaped by the cultural and religious contexts of their time. As Europe plunged into the era of the Crusades, the paladin ideal took on a new dimension. The call to arms in the Holy Land brought together knights from across Europe, united by a common cause, the defense of Christendom against perceived threats. In this chapter, we will trace the transformation of the paladin from a figure of local chivalric duty to a warrior of the global Christian empire. We will explore the motivations behind the Crusades, the role of the paladins in these conflicts, and the complex legacy of these wars, both in the Middle Ages and in the collective memory of Western civilization. With the dawn of the Enlightenment, the world witnessed a profound shift in thought, values, and power structures. The rise of reason, science, and individual rights challenged the traditional notions of chivalry and feudal loyalty that had long defined the paladin. Yet, even in this age of reason, the paladin remained relevant, reimagined as a champion of justice, equality, and human rights. This chapter will explore how the Enlightenment reshaped the paladin ideal, transforming it from a warrior of faith into a defender of universal moral principles. We will examine the paladin's role in revolutionary movements and how this figure became a symbol of the struggle for freedom and human dignity. The 20th century brought with it unprecedented global conflicts, from the 2 world wars to the Cold War, and the ongoing struggle for human rights and justice. In this chapter, we will examine how the paladin ideal evolved in the face of modern warfare, technological advancements, and the rise of global human rights movements. We will look at how the paladin figure was invoked during these conflicts, how it was challenged by the brutal realities of modern war, and how it found new expression in the fight for civil rights and global justice. In our final chapter, we will explore the enduring legacy of the paladin in popular culture. From the pages of fantasy literature to the screens of video games and movies, the paladin has remained a powerful and beloved archetype. This chapter will delve into how modern media has reimagined the paladin, making this ancient figure relevant to new generations. We will examine the role of the paladin in shaping contemporary narratives of heroism, the quest for justice, and the battle between good and evil. As we journey through the history of the paladin, it becomes clear that this figure is more than just a relic of the past. The paladin embodies timeless ideals that continue to inspire and challenge us today. Whether as a warrior on the battlefield, a leader in the fight for human rights, or a hero in our favorite stories, the paladin represents our deepest hopes and aspirations, a symbol of the ongoing struggle to create a world where justice, honor, and compassion prevail. This documentary invites you to explore the rich and complex history of the Paladin, to understand the cultural and historical forces that have shaped this figure, and to reflect on the enduring relevance of the Paladin ideal in our world today. Through this journey, we hope to uncover not only the history of the Paladin, but also the values that continue to make this figure a powerful and enduring symbol of humanity's highest ideals. Chapter 1: Origins of the Paladins. In the annals of history, few figures have captured the imagination and reverence of cultures across the world like the Paladins. Often depicted as noble knights, defenders of the faith, and paragons of virtue, the Paladins represent an ideal that transcends mere human capability. Their story, however, is not just one of myth and legend, but also of real individuals who shaped the course of history through their unwavering commitment to justice, faith, and the protection of the innocent. This documentary series seeks to explore the rich and complex history of the Paladins, tracing their origins, evolution, and enduring legacy across different cultures and time periods. In this first chapter, we delve into the origins of the Paladins, uncovering the historical and mythological roots that gave rise to these legendary figures. The concept of the Paladin can be traced back to ancient civilizations, where the earliest notions of a holy warrior emerged. In Mesopotamia, around 3000 BCE, the Sumerians believed in a class of warrior priests known as the Gudug. These individuals were both protectors of the temple and intermediaries between the gods and the people. The Gudug were charged with defending sacred sites, performing rituals, and ensuring the favor of the gods in times of war. This dual role as both warrior and spiritual leader would become a defining characteristic of the Paladin figure in later cultures. Similarly, in ancient Egypt, the Medjay were a class of warriors who served as protectors of the pharaohs and guardians of the temples. Originally a Nubian people known for their prowess in battle, the Medjay were assimilated into the Egyptian military and given the sacred duty of protecting the divine ruler and the temples of the gods. Their role as both elite soldiers and defenders of the sacred set a precedent for the later development of the Paladin archetype. The fall of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century CE led to a period of turmoil and fragmentation across Europe. During this time, the concept of the warrior priest evolved into something more closely resembling the Paladins we recognize today. As Christian monasticism spread throughout Europe, so too did the idea of a militarized religious order. In the 8th century, the Carolingian Empire under Charlemagne became a focal point for the development of the Paladin ideal. Charlemagne, crowned as the Emperor of the Romans in 800 CE, sought to revive the glory of the Roman Empire while also expanding Christendom. To achieve this, he relied on a group of loyal warriors known as the Palatini, or palace guards, who were entrusted with both military and administrative duties. The Palatini were often chosen from among the nobility and were expected to embody the highest ideals of chivalry and Christian virtue. They were not just soldiers, they were protectors of the faith and exemplars of moral conduct. The legendary Chanson de Roland, written in the 11th century, immortalized these figures as the 12 peers of Charlemagne, the first true paladins in the Western tradition. The Crusades of the 11th to 13th centuries marked a turning point in the history of the Paladins. As European knights embarked on religious wars to reclaim the Holy Land from Muslim rule, the concept of the Paladin as a holy warrior reached its zenith. The Knights of the Crusades saw themselves as defenders of Christendom, fighting not just for earthly kings but for God himself. During this period, several knightly orders were established, each with its own unique mission and code of conduct. The Knights Templar, founded in 1119, became one of the most famous of these orders. Originally established to protect Christian pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land, the Templars soon evolved into a powerful military force. They took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, and were known for their fierce combat skills as well as their deep religious devotion. The Knights Hospitaller and the Teutonic Knights were other prominent orders that emerged during this time. Like the Templars, they combined military prowess with a religious mission, protecting the faithful and spreading Christian ideals. These orders embodied the Paladin ideal, with their members serving as both warriors and protectors of the faith. The concept of the Paladin was further popularized through medieval literature, where these figures were often depicted as the ultimate heroes. The Chanson de Roland and other epic poems like the Matter of France and the Arthurian legends portrayed paladins as paragons of virtue, loyalty, and bravery. These stories, while often embellished with fantastical elements, were rooted in the historical reality of the knightly orders and the cultural values of the time. In these tales, paladins were often depicted as undertaking quests to protect the weak, defend the faith, and uphold justice. They were not just warriors but also moral exemplars, setting the standard for knightly behavior in both life and literature. The influence of these stories extended beyond the Middle Ages, shaping the concept of the paladin in popular culture for centuries to come. As we conclude this first chapter, it becomes clear that the origins of the paladins are deeply intertwined with the history of religious warfare, chivalric ideals, and the concept of the holy warrior. From the warrior priests of ancient civilizations to the knightly orders of the Crusades, the paladin has evolved into a symbol of the highest ideals of faith, justice, and courage. In the chapters that follow, we will explore the evolution of the paladins through the ages, examining their role in different cultures, their impact on history, and their enduring legacy in modern times. The story of the paladins is one of both myth and reality, a testament to the power of ideals in shaping the course of history. Chapter 2: The Rise of the Holy Orders. As the medieval world continued to evolve, so too did the concept of the paladin. From their early origins as warrior priests and protectors of the faith, the paladins gradually became associated with formalized knightly orders that would play a crucial role in shaping the religious and military landscape of Europe. This chapter delves into the rise of these holy orders, exploring how they institutionalized the paladin ideal and expanded their influence across Christendom and beyond. The Knights Templar, officially known as the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, were established in 1119 by a small group of knights led by Hugh de Payens. Their original mission was to protect Christian pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land, which had been recently captured by the Crusaders during the First Crusade. The Templars took their name from the Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem, where they were initially based, and quickly gained a reputation for their dedication, discipline, and martial prowess. The Templars were unique in that they combined the monastic life with the military profession. Like monks, they took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, and they lived under a strict rule of life. However, unlike most monks, the Templars were trained warriors, skilled in the arts of war and committed to defending the Christian faith by force of arms. This dual identity as both monks and knights made them the quintessential paladins of the medieval era. The order grew rapidly in both numbers and influence, attracting support from across Europe. Kings, nobles, and even the Pope himself granted the Templars extensive privileges, including exemptions from local laws and taxes. With these advantages, the Templars amassed considerable wealth and built a network of fortifications, estates, and commanderies throughout Europe and the Holy Land. Their power and prestige reached its peak in the 12th and 13th centuries, making them one of the most formidable military orders of the medieval world. Around the same time that the Templars were rising to prominence, another order was being established with a different, but equally important, mission. The Knights Hospitaller, also known as the Order of St. John, were founded in the 11th century in Jerusalem. Their original purpose was to care for sick, injured, and poor pilgrims who came to the Holy Land. Like the Templars, the Hospitallers combined a religious vocation with military duties, but their focus was on providing medical care and hospitality rather than purely on warfare. The Hospitallers operated a hospital in Jerusalem that became renowned for its quality of care, attracting patients from across the Christian world. Over time, the order expanded its activities to include the defense of Christian territories in the Holy Land, particularly after the fall of Jerusalem in 1187. The Hospitallers, like the Templars, took monastic vows and were organized into a hierarchical structure with strict rules governing their conduct. As the Crusader states in the Holy Land began to falter, the Hospitallers shifted their base of operations to the island of Rhodes in 1309, where they established a new stronghold. From there, they continued their mission of defending Christian lands against Muslim forces, particularly the Ottoman Empire. Their naval fleet became a key asset in the defense of the Mediterranean, and they played a crucial role in several major battles and sieges. While the Templars and Hospitallers were focused primarily on the Holy Land and the Mediterranean, another knightly order was emerging in northern Europe with a mission to convert and conquer the pagan peoples of the Baltic region. The Teutonic Knights, founded in 1190 during the Third Crusade, began as a hospital brotherhood similar to the Hospitallers, but they soon took on a more militaristic role. The Teutonic Knights were invited by the Duke of Masovia in 1226 to help defend his lands against the pagan Prussians. In return, the order was granted control over any territory they could conquer. Over the next century, the Teutonic Knights launched a series of campaigns known as the Northern Crusades, subjugating the Prussians, Lithuanians, and other Baltic tribes. They established a powerful state centered around their fortress at Marienburg, modern-day Malbork, Poland, which became the capital of their order. The Teutonic Knights were known for their strict discipline, martial skill, and religious fervor. They saw themselves as crusaders for the faith, bringing Christianity to the pagan lands of the north by force if necessary. Like the Templars and Hospitallers, they took monastic vows and lived according to a rigid code of conduct. Their distinctive white mantles emblazoned with a black cross became a symbol of their order, and their influence extended across northern and central Europe. While the Templars, Hospitallers, and Teutonic Knights were the most prominent knightly orders of the medieval period, they were not the only ones. Numerous other orders were established during the Crusades and later periods, each with its own unique mission and character. However, all of these orders shared a common set of ideals and values that were encapsulated in the concept of chivalry. Chivalry was the code of conduct that governed the behavior of knights, including those who belonged to the holy orders. It emphasized virtues such as bravery, loyalty, honor, and courtesy, as well as a commitment to protect the weak and uphold justice. For the Paladins, this code was not just a set of guidelines but a sacred duty, one that was closely tied to their religious beliefs. The Paladins were expected to embody the highest ideals of chivalry in both their personal and public lives. They were to be fearless in battle, unwavering in their faith, and selfless in their service to others. The code of chivalry became the moral framework within which the Paladins operated, guiding their actions and shaping their identity. By the late medieval period, the power and influence of the knightly orders began to wane. The fall of the Crusader states in the Holy Land, the rise of centralized monarchies, and changing military technologies all contributed to their decline. The Templars, in particular, faced a dramatic and violent end in the early 14th century when they were accused of heresy and disbanded by Pope Clement V under pressure from King Philip IV of France. Many Templars were arrested, tortured, and executed, and their vast wealth was seized by the crown. Despite their decline, the legacy of the knightly orders lived on. The ideals of the Paladins, as embodied by the Templars, Hospitallers, Teutonic Knights, and others, continued to inspire generations of knights and warriors. The concept of the holy warrior, committed to both faith and justice, became a powerful symbol in medieval and later European culture. In this chapter, we have explored the rise of the holy orders and their role in institutionalizing the Paladin ideal. From the Templars in the Holy Land to the Teutonic Knights in the Baltic, these orders played a crucial role in shaping the religious and military landscape of medieval Europe. They embodied the highest ideals of chivalry and faith, serving as both warriors and protectors of the Christian world. As we move forward in this documentary series, we will examine how the Paladin ideal evolved in the later medieval and early modern periods, as well as its enduring influence in contemporary culture. The story of the Paladins is far from over, and their legacy continues to resonate in the modern imagination. Chapter 3: Late Middle Ages and Renaissance. As Europe transitioned from the Middle Ages to the Renaissance, the role and image of the Paladins began to change. The knightly orders that had once dominated the landscape were now facing new challenges and evolving societal norms. The late Middle Ages and Renaissance periods marked a time of significant transformation, where the Paladin ideal was both preserved and reinterpreted in response to the shifting political, religious, and cultural dynamics. This chapter explores how the concept of the Paladin adapted during these centuries and the enduring impact it had on European society. The late Middle Ages were marked by significant developments in military technology and tactics that fundamentally altered the nature of warfare. The introduction of gunpowder and the widespread use of firearms and cannons made the heavily armored knight on horseback increasingly obsolete. The fortified castles and strongholds that had once been the bastions of the knightly orders were no longer impenetrable in the face of artillery. These changes in warfare had a profound impact on the Paladins, who had traditionally been associated with the ideals of chivalric combat. The battlefield was no longer a place for the individual heroism of knights, but rather one dominated by disciplined infantry formations and massed firepower. As the military role of knights diminished, so too did the prominence of the Paladin as a warrior figure. Despite this, the Paladin ideal persisted, albeit in a more symbolic and less martial form. The values of chivalry, honor, and religious devotion remained deeply embedded in European culture, even as the nature of warfare evolved. Paladins were increasingly seen as defenders of the faith in a moral and spiritual sense, rather than purely as military figures. The 16th century brought about the Protestant Reformation, a religious upheaval that challenged the authority of the Catholic Church and led to the fragmentation of Christendom in Western Europe. The Reformation had a profound impact on the concept of the Paladin, as the religious and cultural divisions that emerged redefined what it meant to be a defender of the faith. For Catholic Europe, the Paladin remained a symbol of the fight against heresy and the defense of the true faith. The Counter-Reformation, led by the Catholic Church in response to the Protestant movement, saw the revival of militant Catholicism. The Paladins were idealized as champions of Catholic orthodoxy, fighting to preserve the unity of the Church and its traditional teachings. In Protestant regions, however, the concept of the Paladin was reinterpreted to fit the new religious context. Protestant leaders and thinkers adapted the Paladin ideal to represent the struggle against what they perceived as the corruption and tyranny of the Catholic Church. The paladin became a symbol of the righteous warrior fighting for religious reform and the establishment of a purer, more authentic faith. This dual interpretation of the paladin ideal reflected the deep religious divides of the time and highlighted the enduring power of the paladin as a symbol of spiritual and moral righteousness, regardless of the specific religious cause. The Renaissance, a period of cultural rebirth and intellectual exploration that spanned the 14th to the 17th centuries, saw a renewed interest in classical antiquity and a flourishing of the arts. The paladin ideal, deeply rooted in medieval chivalry, was revisited and reimagined in the literature and art of this period. One of the most significant literary works to feature the paladins during the Renaissance was Orlando Furioso by Ludovico Ariosto, published in its final form in 1532. This epic poem, a continuation of Orlando Innamorato by Matteo Maria Boiardo, tells the story of the paladin Orlando, Roland, and his adventures during the wars between Charlemagne's Christian knights and the Saracens. Orlando Furioso blends elements of chivalric romance with classical mythology and Renaissance humanism, presenting the paladins as both heroic and deeply human characters, with flaws and personal struggles. The poem was immensely popular and had a profound influence on Renaissance literature and art. The depiction of the paladins in Orlando Furioso and other works of the time contributed to the romanticized image of these figures as noble, larger-than-life heroes, embodying the ideals of courage, honor, and devotion to a higher cause. This image of the paladin would continue to resonate in European culture for centuries to come. In the visual arts, the Renaissance saw the depiction of paladins in paintings, tapestries, and sculptures. Artists like Raphael, who included scenes of paladins in his works, often portrayed them in idealized, classical forms, reflecting the Renaissance fascination with antiquity and the human figure. These artistic representations helped to solidify the paladin as a timeless symbol of heroism and virtue. The Age of Exploration, which began in the late 15th century, saw European powers expanding their influence across the globe. This period of discovery and conquest was often framed in terms of a religious mission, with explorers and conquistadors portraying themselves as the paladins of Christendom, bringing the light of Christianity to the heathen peoples of the New World and beyond. Figures like Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro were often cast as paladins in the Spanish imagination, their conquests in the Americas seen as extensions of the Reconquista, the centuries-long campaign to drive the Moors from the Iberian Peninsula. These conquistadors believed themselves to be on a divine mission, not unlike the paladins of old who fought in the Crusades. However, the brutal realities of conquest, colonization, and the treatment of indigenous populations contrasted sharply with the chivalric ideals associated with the paladins. The image of the paladin as a noble, virtuous warrior was increasingly challenged by the realities of imperial expansion and the often ruthless pursuit of wealth and power. Despite these contradictions, the paladin ideal continued to serve as a powerful narrative tool, justifying the actions of European explorers and soldiers in the name of faith and civilization. The tension between the ideal and the reality of the paladin figure would continue to shape European attitudes toward exploration and conquest in the centuries to come. By the late Renaissance, the traditional knightly orders that had once been the embodiment of the paladin ideal were in decline. The rise of professional standing armies and the centralization of state power diminished the military role of the knights, while the religious conflicts of the Reformation and Counter-Reformation further eroded their influence. Some orders, like the Hospitallers, managed to survive by adapting to the changing times. The Hospitallers, after being driven from Rhodes by the Ottomans, established a new base on the island of Malta in 1530, where they became known as the Knights of Malta. From there, they continued their mission of defending Christendom, particularly against the Ottoman Empire, and played a key role in the Battle of Lepanto in 1571. However, other orders, like the Teutonic Knights, saw their power and influence wane significantly. The Teutonic Order, which had once ruled a powerful state in the Baltic, was secularized in 1525 by Grand Master Albert of Brandenburg, who converted to Lutheranism and transformed the order's territories into the Duchy of Prussia. This marked the end of the Teutonic Knights as a major political and military force. The decline of the knightly orders reflected the broader changes in European society and the gradual shift away from the medieval worldview that had given rise to the paladin ideal. Yet, even as these orders faded, the legacy of the paladins endured, continuing to inspire and influence the culture and imagination of Europe. The late Middle Ages and Renaissance were periods of profound transformation in Europe, marked by changes in warfare, religion, culture, and society. The paladin ideal, born in the medieval period, was both preserved and reinterpreted in response to these changes. While the traditional role of the paladin as a warrior of the faith diminished, the ideals of chivalry, honor, and religious devotion continued to resonate. In the next chapter, we will explore how the concept of the paladin evolved during the Enlightenment and beyond, as Europe entered the modern era. The paladins, though rooted in the medieval past, would continue to find relevance in a world increasingly shaped by reason, science, and the challenges of modernity. Chapter 4: The Enlightenment and the Transformation of the Paladin Ideal. The Enlightenment, a period spanning the late 17th and 18th centuries, brought about a seismic shift in European thought and culture. Characterized by an emphasis on reason, science, and individual rights, the Enlightenment challenged the traditional structures of authority and belief that had dominated the medieval and Renaissance eras. As Europe moved toward modernity, the concept of the paladin, once a symbol of chivalric honor and religious devotion, underwent significant transformation. This chapter examines how the Enlightenment redefined the paladin ideal, reflecting the broader changes in society and the intellectual landscape of the time. As the Enlightenment took hold, the values associated with chivalry began to lose their central place in European culture. The medieval notions of honor, fealty, and religious warfare, which had defined the paladin ideal for centuries, were increasingly seen as relics of a bygone era. The rise of rationalism and humanism shifted the focus away from the collective duties of knighthood and toward the rights and dignity of the individual. The decline of the traditional aristocracy and the rise of the bourgeoisie further eroded the social foundations of chivalry. The warrior noble class that had once produced the paladins was gradually replaced by a new elite, whose power was based on wealth, commerce, and intellectual achievement rather than martial prowess and feudal obligations. In this changing social order, the paladin, as a figure of the old feudal system, seemed increasingly out of place. However, while the Enlightenment cast doubt on the traditional ideals of chivalry, it also provided an opportunity to reinterpret the paladin in a new light. The paladin's commitment to justice, virtue, and the defense of the weak could be recast in terms of Enlightenment values, such as the pursuit of reason, the protection of human rights, and the promotion of universal moral principles. During the Enlightenment, the concept of the paladin evolved into that of the enlightened hero, a figure who embodied the new ideals of reason, justice, and humanity. Enlightenment thinkers, such as Voltaire, Rousseau, and Montesquieu, advocated for a rational and moral approach to governance, society, and individual conduct. In this context, the paladin was reimagined as a champion of these principles, no longer fighting for religious or feudal causes but for the broader good of humanity. Voltaire's Candide, published in 1759, is a notable example of this transformation. While not a traditional paladin story, Candide features the character of Pangloss, whose unwavering optimism and commitment to reason, despite the absurdities of the world, reflect the Enlightenment's faith in human progress. The protagonist, Candide, also embodies the idea of the enlightened hero as he travels the world, confronting the evils of war, fanaticism, and tyranny, and ultimately seeking a life guided by reason and moral integrity. In literature and philosophy, the paladin was no longer defined by his loyalty to a king or a church, but by his dedication to principles of justice, equality, and the betterment of society. This reimagined paladin was a thinker, a reformer, and a defender of the rights of individuals, qualities that resonated with the intellectual currents of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment's emphasis on individual rights and the critique of tyranny found practical expression in the revolutionary movements that swept across Europe and the Americas in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. These revolutions, most notably the American Revolution, 1775 to 1783, and the French Revolution, 1789 to 1799, were driven by Enlightenment ideals and often invoked the imagery of the paladin in their rhetoric and symbolism. In the American Revolution, figures like George Washington were sometimes cast as modern-day paladins, defenders of liberty and justice against the tyranny of the British Crown. Washington, in particular, was idealized as a virtuous leader who embodied the best qualities of the classical hero and the chivalric knight, leading his people to freedom with honor and integrity. Similarly, during the French Revolution, the paladin ideal was invoked to justify the struggle against the Ancien regime. Revolutionary leaders portrayed themselves as champions of the people, fighting to overthrow the oppressive structures of the monarchy and the church in the name of liberty, equality, and fraternity. The revolutionaries saw themselves as heirs to the tradition of the paladins, but their battle was no longer for the glory of kings or the sanctity of religion, it was for the rights and dignity of all people. However, the revolutionary use of the paladin ideal also exposed its complexities and contradictions. While the paladins of the past had fought for order and hierarchy, the revolutionary paladins fought to dismantle these very structures. The violence and turmoil of the French Revolution, including the Reign of Terror, challenged the notion of the paladin as a purely noble and virtuous figure, revealing the potential for ideals to be twisted in the pursuit of power. In the early 19th century, the Romantic movement emerged as a reaction against the rationalism of the Enlightenment, bringing with it a renewed interest in the medieval past and the ideals of chivalry. Romanticism celebrated emotion, imagination, and the sublime, often drawing inspiration from the myths, legends, and historical figures of the Middle Ages. In this cultural climate, the figure of the paladin experienced a revival, reimagined as a symbol of individual heroism and the quest for meaning in a rapidly changing world. Sir Walter Scott's novels, such as Ivanhoe, 1819, played a significant role in rekindling interest in the medieval chivalric tradition. In Ivanhoe, Scott portrays the titular character as a noble knight who embodies the ideals of honor, loyalty, and courage. Though set in a romanticized version of medieval England, Ivanhoe reflects the contemporary yearning for a return to the values of the past, at a time when the Industrial Revolution and modernity were reshaping society. The Romantic revival of the paladin ideal also influenced art, music, and popular culture. The figure of the knight, once again idealized as a heroic and virtuous warrior, became a central theme in the works of artists and composers. Richard Wagner's operas, such as Lohengrin and Parsifal, drew heavily on medieval legends and the concept of the paladin, portraying these figures as embodiments of spiritual purity and noble sacrifice. However, the Romantic paladin was not merely a nostalgic figure. In the context of the 19th century, the paladin also represented the individual's struggle against the alienation and dislocation of modern life. The romantic hero, like the paladins of old, was often depicted as a solitary figure on a quest for truth, justice, and personal fulfillment, even in the face of overwhelming odds. As the 19th century progressed, the paladin ideal became intertwined with the ideologies of empire and nationalism. European powers, engaged in the colonization of Africa, Asia, and the Americas, often invoked the imagery of the paladin to justify their imperial ambitions. The idea of the paladin as a civilizing force, bringing the light of Western values to the uncivilized parts of the world, became a powerful narrative that underpinned the expansion of European empires. In the British Empire, figures like General Charles George Gordon, known as Gordon of Khartoum, were lionized as modern paladins. Gordon, who was killed defending Khartoum against Mahdiist forces in 1885, was celebrated as a martyr for the British imperial cause, embodying the virtues of courage, sacrifice, and moral righteousness. His death became a symbol of the supposed nobility of the imperial mission, despite the controversial nature of British actions in the region. However, the use of the paladin ideal to support imperialism also exposed its darker side. The notion of the paladin as a bearer of civilization was often used to mask the realities of exploitation, violence, and oppression that accompanied European colonialism. The paladin's traditional role as a defender of the weak was inverted, as colonial powers justified their domination of other peoples in the name of a supposedly higher moral purpose. The Enlightenment and the subsequent centuries saw the paladin ideal undergo significant transformation, as it was reinterpreted to fit the changing intellectual, cultural, and political landscape of Europe. From the rational hero of the Enlightenment to the romanticized knight of the 19th century, the paladin remained a powerful symbol, adaptable to the needs and aspirations of each era. Yet, as this chapter has shown, the paladin ideal also became increasingly complex and contested. As Europe moved toward modernity, the contradictions inherent in the paladin figure, between nobility and violence, civilization and conquest, became more apparent. In the next chapter, we will explore how the paladin ideal evolved in the 20th century, as the world grappled with the challenges of global conflict, decolonization, and the quest for human rights. The paladin, though a product of the medieval past, would continue to find relevance and meaning in the tumultuous modern world. Chapter 5: The Paladin Ideal in the Modern World. As the world entered the 20th century, the paladin ideal, rooted in the medieval past, faced unprecedented challenges. The cataclysms of 2 world wars, the rise and fall of empires, the horrors of genocide, and the global struggle for human rights forced society to confront the complexities and contradictions of the paladin figure. In this final chapter, we will examine how the paladin ideal evolved in the modern era, exploring its relevance in the context of global conflict, the quest for justice, and the enduring human need for heroes. As we conclude, we will reflect on the paladin's legacy and its place in the collective imagination of the modern world. The 20th century was marked by the 2 world wars, which redefined the nature of warfare and tested the limits of human endurance. In this context, the paladin ideal was both invoked and challenged, as the world grappled with the unprecedented scale of violence and the moral dilemmas it brought. During World War I, the notion of the paladin as a noble warrior was severely tested. The mechanized slaughter of trench warfare, with its impersonal and industrial nature, seemed to strip away the romanticism of the battlefield. The knights of old, with their chivalric codes and ideals of honor, were distant figures in a war characterized by machine guns, poison gas, and mass casualties. Yet, even in this brutal conflict, there were those who sought to embody the paladin spirit. Acts of bravery, such as the story of the Red Baron Manfred von Richthofen, who was both feared and respected by his enemies, captured the imagination of a war-weary public. These figures were seen as modern-day paladins, fighting with honor in a war that often seemed devoid of it. World War II further complicated the paladin ideal. The war was framed by many as a battle between good and evil, with the Allied forces often portrayed as the righteous defenders of freedom against the tyranny of the Axis powers. Leaders like Winston Churchill and Franklin D. Roosevelt were cast as modern paladins, leading their nations through the darkest times with resolve and moral clarity. The soldiers who fought in this war were often idealized as heroes, standing against the atrocities of fascism and genocide. However, the moral ambiguities of war, including the bombing of civilian populations, the use of nuclear weapons, and the internment of Japanese Americans, challenged the simplistic narrative of the paladin as a purely virtuous figure. The war's aftermath, with the revelations of the Holocaust and the onset of the Cold War, further complicated the notion of the paladin in a world where the lines between right and wrong were increasingly blurred. The post-war era saw the emergence of a global movement for human rights, driven by the horrors of the Holocaust and the desire to prevent such atrocities from ever occurring again. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted by the United Nations in 1948, was a landmark moment in this movement, affirming the inherent dignity and rights of all people. In this context, the paladin ideal was reinterpreted to fit the new global focus on justice, equality, and the protection of human rights. The paladin was no longer just a warrior, he was a defender of the oppressed, a champion of justice in the face of tyranny. Figures like Martin Luther King Jr., Nelson Mandela, and Mahatma Gandhi emerged as modern paladins, leading nonviolent struggles for civil rights, racial equality, and the end of colonialism. These leaders, though not warriors in the traditional sense, embodied the paladin's commitment to justice and the defense of the vulnerable. The paladin ideal also found expression in the realm of international law, with the establishment of the International Criminal Court, ICC, in 2002. The ICC, with its mandate to prosecute individuals for genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity, represented a new kind of paladin, a legal institution dedicated to upholding justice on a global scale. The court's pursuit of justice, however, has been fraught with challenges, including questions of fairness, sovereignty, and the political complexities of international relations. In the modern world, the paladin ideal has found new life in popular culture, particularly in literature, film, and video games. The figure of the paladin, with its blend of heroism, moral integrity, and dedication to a higher cause, continues to resonate with audiences seeking stories of good versus evil, sacrifice, and redemption. The fantasy genre, in particular, has embraced the paladin archetype, often depicting knights and warriors who embody the values of chivalry and honor. J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings is a prime example, with characters like Aragorn and Gandalf serving as modern paladins, leading the fight against the dark forces threatening Middle-earth. These characters, while rooted in medieval traditions, reflect modern concerns about power, corruption, and the importance of moral courage. In video games, the paladin has become a popular character class, representing the noble warrior who uses both sword and magic to protect the weak and uphold justice. Games like World of Warcraft and Diablo have introduced millions of players to the paladin archetype, allowing them to step into the role of the righteous hero in fantastical worlds. These games, while fictional, offer players the opportunity to explore the challenges and responsibilities of the paladin, often forcing them to make difficult moral choices in their quest for justice. The Paladin's presence in popular culture underscores the enduring appeal of the hero's journey, a narrative that continues to inspire and captivate people across the world. Whether in books, movies, or games, the Paladin represents the timeless struggle between good and evil, order and chaos, and the quest for meaning in a complex and often troubling world. As we move further into the 21st century, the Paladin ideal continues to evolve, reflecting the new challenges and opportunities of the modern world. In an era defined by global interconnectedness, technological advancements, and the ongoing struggle for human rights, the Paladin remains a relevant and powerful symbol. The modern Paladin may be a human rights activist fighting against oppression, a whistleblower exposing corruption, or a leader advocating for environmental justice. These contemporary paladins, like their medieval predecessors, are driven by a sense of duty and a commitment to a higher cause, whether it be justice, truth, or the preservation of the planet. The paladin's quest is no longer confined to the battlefield. It has expanded to include the courts of law, the halls of government, and the streets of protest. At the same time, the complexities of the modern world have made the Paladin ideal more challenging to uphold. The rise of global terrorism, the threat of climate change, and the proliferation of disinformation have blurred the lines between good and evil, making it harder to discern the true Paladins from those who merely claim the mantle. In this context, the Paladin must be vigilant, not only in their actions but in their adherence to the principles of justice, integrity, and respect for human dignity. The Paladin ideal, born in the medieval era and shaped by centuries of change, remains a powerful and enduring symbol in the modern world. From the battlefields of the Crusades to the civil rights movements of the 20th century, the Paladin has embodied humanity's highest aspirations: courage, honor, justice, and the defense of the vulnerable. Even as the world has changed, the need for heroes who stand for these values has not diminished. In the end, the Paladin is more than just a warrior or a defender of the faith. The Paladin represents the eternal human quest for meaning and moral clarity in a world that is often chaotic and uncertain. Whether in history, literature, or modern life, the Paladin's journey reminds us of the importance of striving for a higher purpose, even in the face of overwhelming odds. As we look to the future, the legacy of the Paladin will continue to inspire and challenge us, calling on each generation to take up the mantle of the hero, to fight for justice, and to protect the dignity and rights of all people. The Paladin may have begun as a figure of medieval legend, but their story is far from over. It is a story that we are all a part of, and one that will continue to unfold as long as there are those who seek to make the world a better place. Thank you for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe.